SEP FanFic Readings presents Thanks to the Photographs by Unstable Hufflepuff. Chapter 20. I am yours, but are you mine? Draco stood next to Potter, both of them staring at the parchment-strewn floor with identical clenched jaws. There were shopping lists, to-do list, wish list, 5-year plans, lesson outlines, and so much more that neither of them could even hope to comprehend. This was what Hermione had been working on ever since she left Knot Manor last night. Draco thought her mind should be studied by a team of unspeakables in the Department of Mysteries, because that thing was clearly the 8th wonder of the world. All this because of something Lavender said, Potter said, sounding rather unsettled. I haven't seen her like this since our OWLs. If you speak to your wife, I'm sure she'll tell you the NEWTs were worse, Draco told him. I actually witnessed Ginevra dragging her out of the library by her ear. Potter chuckled, then crouched down to pick up a piece of parchment nearest them. He straightened up to his full height as he studied it with a furrowed brow. I think this is her fighting back, he said quietly after a minute. He handed the parchment to Draco. It was another list, its title written in big, bold letters, Change in Lifestyle. He scanned the contents of the list, his eyebrows rising. Weasley had better watch himself, he muttered. Potter scoffed. Yeah, an angry Hermione is definitely a force to be reckoned with. You don't have to tell me that. He reached for another sheet of parchment, the ghost of a smile on his lips, and held it up for Draco to see. It was a list of things in her life that she wanted to keep, and Potter pointed to a word at the very bottom. Just one word. Draco. I don't reckon you've got anything to worry about, Malfoy. It took every ounce of strength in Draco's body not to let Potter see him smile. Even still, he could feel his face heating up. He felt like he was a little boy again, racing down the halls of Malfoy Manor to open his presents on Christmas morning. Hermione often made him feel like that. Perhaps that was why he liked her so much. For most of his life, he had felt as though he wasn't allowed to relax, but Hermione had given him permission to just be himself, whoever that was. She let him laugh. She let him flop down on furniture. She let him act like a child, and it was so incredibly freeing. He didn't want to ever go back to life before she was in it, or rather, before she played such a central role in it. He had taken every last bit of her she permitted him, and asked for no more, because he couldn't risk chasing her away. But this gave him hope that he could have more, and he desperately needed that. When his mother had come to visit the month prior, she had made it clear that anything more with Hermione was out of the question. I cannot stop you from befriending your fellow members of staff, she had said, but be sensible, Draco. Her birth alone is reason enough to avoid her. But the way she has been, well, it is not for polite conversation, so I'll say no more on the subject. Draco's father had said nothing at all, and he could not tell whether that was good or very, very bad. He knew what they thought. He was throwing his life away, making a fool of himself. They would probably admit him to the Janus Thicky ward at St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries if they thought they could get away with it. He was their heir, and it was his responsibility to create another. He wanted that, a family of his own, but he wasn't so sure the heir he produced would be up to his parents' standards. Even he himself would have been horrified if someone had told him 10 years ago that he might have a half-blood for a son. But he wanted Hermione. He wanted her for life, no matter how short of time they spent together. She had the power to breathe life into him, and he refused to let that go. Being with her, however, meant that he might become another name taken off the family tree. It would likely break his mother's heart. His father would never speak to him again. If you are still seeing Miss Granger, do not bother visiting the manor for the holidays this year, Draco's mother had written in the most recent letter, and he knew she was being serious. If he was with Hermione, he would no longer be welcome at Malfoy Manor. So he needed to know if Hermione was as serious about him as he was about her, and he needed to know now. There would be no going back for him, and he was too afraid to take that leap of faith by himself. The problem was that she had been denying him any sort of real affection. She kept him at a distance, even when they were as close as two people could be. There was no passionate lovemaking. They did not hold each other close and stare deeply into each other's eyes as they somehow reached climax simultaneously, whispering sweet nothings. They had lazy sex some mornings, when neither had the energy or the motivation to leave the warmth of their beds just yet. There was the spirited and often aggressive sex that they had when one of them was excited or had just figured something out. They had messy sex when they were drunk, which often involved a lot of things breaking and waking up the next morning with bruises in strange places. Sometimes they had playful sex when they were relaxed and happy, and in the mood to tease each other endlessly. Draco hadn't realized just how limited his experience was before he began sleeping with Hermione. It made him feel inadequate, a lot of the time, especially when she'd start lecturing him right in the middle of sex. But then, when he'd get it right, it was so incredibly worth the embarrassment. The feeling of absolute elation he got every time she praised him was like a drug. He would do almost anything to get it. It was the opposite of how he treated her while they were in school together. Back then, he made it his goal to put her down, but now, all he wanted was to please her. Did she feel the same way? He had been going along with whatever she wanted, going along with whatever it was they were doing, but that had to stop now. He had to know if she had any interest in becoming something genuine before he set his whole life aflame for her. No, no, and no! You cannot put the armchair there! Have you no eye for design? Don't be rude to Creature, Pansy. He's doing a wonderful job. Draco sat at the yet-to-be-replaced plain wooden table, drinking tea, while he watched Hermione and Pansy redecorate Hermione's living quarters with Creature's assistance. They had spent all of Monday afternoon after classes were over out shopping in Muggle London. Needless to say, there had been quite a bit of arguing. What is that? Do you know anything about decorative pillows? You cannot simply place the little one in front of the big one. They've got to be staggered. There. See? I honestly can't tell the difference. You are so lucky I am here to help you. That frame is far too small to hang on the wall. Pansy stormed over to Creature, her hands on her hips. It should sit on the bookshelf. You shriveled up little... Hermione threw one of her new decorative pillows at her. It was powder blue with white trim and rather elegant needlework. Really quite lovely. Be nice to him. Oh, to him, is it? House elves deserve to be treated with the same respect given to any other living being. Do not treat him as though he were an animal. Pansy merely rolled her eyes and turned away, effectively ending the conversation. She wandered over to the large bookshelf, pursing her lips in thought. These should be color-coded, she said decidedly, already reaching for a book, despite Hermione's sputtering protests. Perhaps we can have a shelf dedicated to cool tones, and one that's... From within the pages of the book, a piece of parchment slipped. Hermione immediately raced over, nearly tripping on a box of framed photographs that Potter had dropped off the day before, and reached for it. Pansy held it away from her, scanning its contents with narrowed eyes, as Hermione attempted to grab a hold of it. Suddenly, a wide grin spread across Pansy's face, and she looked up at Hermione, her eyes glinting. Granger, she said softly, who is Sophia, and why does she miss the taste of your... Draco's jaw dropped. That is none of your business, snapped Hermione, going red in the face. She attempted once more to take the parchment away from Pansy, only to have her slip past and hand it to Draco. Do not read that! More than curious, Draco frowned at her, taking what appeared to be the letter. He found himself gaping at the words in front of him. He was utterly speechless. He had known that Hermione had slept with Malcolm Adler while she was studying under him, but he did not expect that their relationship included something like this. He did not expect that Hermione would even be interested in something like this. He suddenly felt very insecure. Was he not enough to sate her? It only happened a couple of times, Hermione told him, sounding anxious. She sat down beside him, wringing her hands in her lap. I was just, I don't know, experimenting. He stared at her. Experimenting? Repeated Pansy with a cackle. Oh, Granger, this is too good. Could you give us a moment? Draco asked her sharply, though it was far from her request. Just so you know, I'm not really into that, she said, ignoring him. She held up her hands, letting out another cackle. But from what I've heard, that Smith girl you two are friends with would be more than happy to join in if you wanted to spice things up in the bedroom. Fuck off, Pansy. Laughing boisterously, Pansy drew her wand and levitated a box of new bedding and more decorative pillows, and disappeared into the bedroom with it. Draco turned to Hermione, taking a steadying breath. He needed to approach this delicately so as not to offend her. Are you... He swallowed and tried again. Are you interested in women? Hermione shook her head at once, and he let out a breath of relief. So you aren't attracted to them? No, she said quietly. She sighed, twisting around in her chair to face him properly. When I was in Venice, I did a lot of things that I wouldn't normally do. I ignored any repercussions my actions could have had and simply did as I pleased, I guess. Sophia is Malcolm's assistant. Sometimes we would go out, the three of us, and I enjoyed it. I did, but I didn't really know what I was doing. I just did what felt good. She gave him a pleading look and then added, Does any of that make sense? Draco nodded, looking down at the table. It did make sense. In fact, it explained a lot of her behavior in the few months since they'd reconnected. He'd often been shocked by her, because nothing she did was reminiscent of the Hermione Granger he knew in school. Of course, she had her moments when that side of her, the truest side, would come out, and those were what had made him fall in love with her. Because he did love her. He loved her for the moments she made him feel as though he were light as a feather, as though there was nothing dragging him down. He loved her for the moments when she held him close and promised him that she didn't hold any of his past actions against him. He loved her for letting him be a new person, a better person, the person he wanted to be. But he had no idea if she loved him too. What if it had all been a phase? She was getting her life together now, that's what Potter said. What if that did not involve him? Had he just been another action she was ignoring the repercussions of? Something she was just doing because she could, and it felt good. Them being together would have so many repercussions. It already had. The Daily Prophet and Witch Weekly were still publishing speculative articles about them, and none of them were positive. Hermione had not thought any of this through, had she? Draco stood up, growing angry. He clenched his fist, trying to contain it. He did not want to get angry at her. He did not want to remind her of the person he used to be, but he could not keep quiet anymore. What are we doing, Hermione? She looked confused. I mean, what is this? He asked, the fury evident in his tone, regardless of his attempt to mask it. We spend all of our time together. We sleep in the same bed. We act like we're fucking married. And yet, it means nothing to you. Draco, that's not... Don't you dare deny it, he shouted, and Hermione flinched. You are constantly keeping me at a distance, pretending that there's nothing between us. Am I just a game to you? How could you possibly think that? She demanded, standing up. How the fuck do you think? You act like fucking me is just a hobby to you. Just something to pass the time, or scratch an itch, or whatever. I don't fucking know. Is it because I was here? Is it just because I was available? No, of course not, shouted Hermione, outraged. Do I mean anything to you? Anything at all? Asked Draco desperately, hating himself for sounding so pathetic. Because I can't keep fucking doing this. Hermione had been moving towards him, but stopped in her tracks at those words. What? She said, her voice almost a whisper. My parents don't want me coming home because of you, and that's not your fault. It isn't. But I can't keep doing this. I can't tear my family apart if you just act like I'm nothing, like this isn't real. Hermione stared at him, her mouth falling open. She appeared to be on the verge of tears. The room felt cold, even though the windows were closed. I just want you to be mine, Hermione, Draco told her wearily, because I've already been yours for a while now. She didn't say anything for a long time. Draco was nearly out of breath, and for every second that she did not speak, his heart sank further in his chest. He should have known this would happen. He should have known that he didn't matter to her. He should have not put any faith in something as minuscule as his name on a piece of parchment. He stuffed his hands in his pockets, clenching his jaw, and tore his eyes away from her. Without another word, he walked out the door. The corridor outside was blurred, and he tilted his head upwards to keep any tears from falling. He was willing to throw away his life for her, and she did not care. He made it halfway down the corridor before he heard her calling out from behind him. Draco Lucius Malfoy, you stop what you're doing right now! His steps faltered, and he paused, but he did not turn around. You seriously think you mean nothing to me? She said, her voice shaking slightly. You mean everything to me. Draco could have sworn his heart must beat, but he still did not look at her. I'm sorry I made you feel that way, she continued, and he clenched his jaw tighter when her voice broke. I'm sorry for not taking you seriously. I didn't know how. For the last 2 years, I haven't taken anything seriously. I didn't think anything through. I didn't let myself worry about how my actions would affect the people around me. I just didn't care. Her footsteps echoed in the silent corridor as she drew near. She inhaled sharply when she reached him, standing so close that he could feel her warmth on his back. I'm trying to be better. I want to be better, she said tearfully, pausing to take in another deep breath. But I'm still figuring it out. I understand if you don't want to wait around for that. But if there's any chance you're willing to be patient with me, I'd be more than happy to be yours. A tear escaped, and Draco hastily wiped it away, scarcely believing what he was hearing. Hermione leaned forwards, resting her forehead on his shoulder. Her voice dropped to a whisper. You were never a game to me, Draco. You are the one person in this world who gives me hope that I could still be worth something. Ever so slowly, Draco turned around, meeting her gaze at last. She had so much hope in her eyes that he constantly dreamt of getting lost in. If only she'd give him the chance. And in that moment, he was sure that she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He removed his hands from the pockets of his trousers and raised them to cup her cheeks, lowering his face to hers. Do you really mean that? He asked in a small voice. Hermione nodded, sniffling a little. The warmth started in his chest and slowly spread outwards, all the way up to the top of his head, out to the tips of his fingers and down to his toes. He felt himself smiling, and even if he wanted to, he could not have stopped himself from leaning in the rest of the way to press his lips to hers. Everything would be okay, Draco knew, because Hermione would take care of him, and he would take care of her in return. Well, isn't this touching? Draco and Hermione broke apart and glanced back down the corridor, where Pansy stood, leaning against the stone wall, her arms crossed over her chest and a smug grin on her face. Fuck off, Pansy, they said together.